Restore Britain, the scrappy, even more right-wing little brother of Nigel Farage's imploding Reform UK, is taking advantage of the slow news cycle to get some media coverage. And it was to that end that Restore's leader Rupert Lowe appeared on Radio 4's Today programme. He was there to discuss the party's new economic policy paper, called The Wealth of Our Nation. Despite running to 64 pages long, it doesn't take more than a few sentences to capture its proposals. Shrink the state, cut welfare, radically lower all taxes and bin off net zero. But Lowe, he struggled to stay on topic.
What we're seeing is the gradual Islamification of Britain.
What's the evidence for that?
Or the silent jihad, if you like. And people like the BBC, our national monopoly, which, as you know, I would defund responsibly very quickly should I acquire power. The point is, you have been complicit in watching this gradual spread of Islamicization of Britain, which basically is changing the nature of everything, with them allowed to pursue a parallel system of Sharia courts.
What I asked you for was the evidence.
And the
evidence that we're hurtling towards being an Islamic country.
You didn't cover it once.
What's the evidence for the fact that we're
supposed to inform, educate, and entertain with complete impartiality? We are not doing that.
Later in the interview, Nick Robinson tried to interrogate another claim that Lowe likes to make. Earlier this week, Lowe posted that by 2063, white people would become a minority in Britain. A so-called fact he described as, quote, the outrageous demographic vandalism of mass migration. Robinson asked Lowe to justify that projection.
You quote, and have often quoted, what you say is a prediction that white Britons will be a minority in 2063. Are you aware that by the definitions used in that particular report, King Charles is not a white Briton? Do you think he is a white Briton?
Well, many people have different interpretations of that, Nick. I mean, we can split hairs, but I think...
Well, you're not splitting hairs. Do you think the monarch of this country is a white Briton?
It's quite clear, and I think most British people, if you speak to them, would agree. And that is why
King Charles a white
Britain's
Briton?
Membership is growing very fast. And your listeners are dropping equally fast because you don't reflect actually what's happening.
Why don't you answer the question now we've got you on?
You try and whitewash all of the things that are happening.
Is King Charles a white Briton, Rupert Lowe?
You peddle DEI, you peddle all of the malign agenda, which British people have got bored of.
Right.
So
they're bored of people ignoring the questions, Mr. Lowe. The reason I ask you, and it's a serious question.
It is a fact that by 2063, white British people will be a minority on current trends. I don't think anyone disputes that.
What I was putting to you is that the basis of that forecast, which is widely disputed and based on a whole series of assumptions that none of us know whether they'll be true or not, is that you're only called a white Briton if both of your parents were born in this country. So because Prince Philip was born in Greece, King Charles is not, under your definition, treated as a white Briton.
Next up, Nick Robinson will ask him if he threatens to overrule him. Remember that clip? What's interesting here is that, as soon as he starts asking the question, Rupert Lowe goes, oh, well, most people just broadly agree that he would be a white Briton. I'm like, well, no, you're the one trying to make a very specific demographic point about a very specific definition of what constitutes a white Briton. And you immediately undermine that as soon as it doesn't make sense colloquially in your own mind. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. I do agree with you. Most people would see King Charles as being a white Briton, specifically because of all of the history of the royal family and indeed the fact that he is a citizen of this country, despite the fact that it didn't fit the narrow definition used to create this projection that Rupert Lowe is trying to use for political agitprop purposes. Because, of course you're going to try and skew the metrics just to be able to make your headline as striking as possible, to make all of the headlines, right? That's what's important, rather than the rigorous nature with which that you define, quote unquote, what a white Britain is. Now, Dahlia, do you think that really kind of exposes the level to which that these people will try and manipulate statistics, or is it all just a front to be able to get headlines?
I mean, I think it reveals so many interesting things, that for most of the, recent decades, the right have spent a lot of time trying to create a definition of, real British people that is racial but doesn't seem racial, and so they will use these race neutral terms like values or culture, even though values and culture are not homogenous in Britain. Like the culture of one part of Britain, of rural Britain, is not the same as the culture of urban Britain. There's actually lots of different cultures in Britain, even if you take immigration out of it. They'll say, the problem is that Britain is full. Obviously, they'll say Britain is full at the same time as being like, there's a population crisis because people aren't having enough kids. And I'm like, well, which one is it? Is Britain full? Is it full to the brim? Is it spilling over? Or are there not enough people being born? I think we all know the answer to that. What's interesting about Rupert Lowe is that he's not shy about this being about race. He'll tell you straight, this is about preserving white Britons. And so the gotcha wasn't about, is this about race? Rupert Lowe is very happy for that to be very clearly on the table. The gotcha was that he tried to come up with a fixed definition of white that's not just, I'll know it if I look at you. It's not just the color of your skin or the texture of your hair or your features. And he landed on a definition that he thought was bulletproof, but lapses under the slightest interrogation because King Charles himself, the monarch of this country, would not be considered white British under that definition. And that is really worth sitting with, because what it exposes is that race is irrational. That this idea of white British is not a neutral description of someone's heritage. It's not a value-free judgment. It is a value system. It is race is a hierarchy that ranks human beings on the basis of arbitrary characteristics and says that people who hold certain characteristics are superior to others. Because if you think about this category of two parents born in Britain, on the one hand, it doesn't include someone that we would clearly consider to be white, which is King Charles, but it does include a lot of people who would not be considered white. For example, HMP Windrush landed on the shores here in 1948. So there are many, many people who, if you arrive in 1948, say you have a child, that child is born in 1952, and then that child marries and has a child with another person who was born just after Windrush to a grandparent who came over in the Windrush during the Windrush migrations. You will have someone who will clearly not be considered white, but will have two parents born in Britain. So the test he's always would not be someone that Rupert Lowe would consider in that category of white British, and would consider the demographic that needs to be protected. In fact, he would consider that person to be a demographic that white British people need to be protected from. So the test that he's using, is really exposes the fact that race is irrational, and it's not a neutral. It's not like saying this person comes from this ethnicity that is bound by this particular language or this particular religion or this particular relationship to the land. Whiteness, like all racial categories, is an irrational category that is rooted in, that doesn't exist outside of a hierarchy of values and a hierarchy of who we think is worth something and who we think isn't worth something, based on arbitrary characteristics, based on, I just know it when I look at you, if you're worth something or not.
Now, it's worth going back to the source of Lowe's prediction. It seems to be produced by none other than Reform UK's Matt Goodwin, who authored the report's Demographic Change in the Future of the United Kingdom 2022 to 2122, while he was a fellow at the Centre for Heterodox Social Science at the University of Buckingham just last year. Here he was announcing those findings on the Spectator's podcast.
White Britons will be a minority within the UK by the year 2063. The foreign-born, people born outside of the UK and their immediate descendants, will be a majority by around the year 2079. And by the end of this century, about a quarter of all people in the country will be following Islam, will be Muslim. This country is now looks set to experience a level of demographic change, cultural change, religious change, that I think is unprecedented in its history. So what I'm trying to say, even if it is a bit controversial, is look, everybody needs to just take a step back, look at the wider trends and think about, well, what does this mean for the nation state? What does it mean for our identity? What does it mean for the social contract? And what does it mean, above all, for public trust in the system? And that's why we've put this out.
Goodwin doesn't say what he means by white British there either, but the report appears to define someone as being white British if they're, quote, able to trace their roots in this country back more than 1 or 2 generations. King Charles's father was a migrant, so he's definitely out, along with countless others, including Boris Johnson, whose grandfather was Turkish, Helen Mirren, whose father was Russian. It doesn't make a lot of sense, really, does it? And it gets worse. Goodwin and Lowe are very happy to treat a model as though it's a prediction. A model is a way of working out what could happen if certain assumptions come to pass. If they do come to pass, then it's a prediction, and then it could still be more right or more wrong depending on whether your maths is correct. And the assumptions in Goodwin's model are, well, let's say pretty loose. Here's just one massive flaw. The model is supposed to tell you what will happen over the next 100 years. And yet, it seems to take as a baseline assumption that migration trends will remain exactly the same over the next century as they were between 2021 and 2025, when most incoming migrants were from outside the European Union. But if you'd fix the baseline assumption to the migration trends of, say, 2014 to 2018, just a few years earlier, the model would make a very different prediction on where migrants to Britain would be coming from over the next century. Also especially different when there were specific geopolitical crises that caused the huge amounts of migration in terms of Hong Kong and Afghanistan, very specifically during kind of the Boris wave era that's in the part of the data set that they're using rather than the more EU-focused migration we saw pre-Brexit. Now, Dahlia, what did you make of those comments there? One thing that kind of stood out to me really was this idea that we're going to see this massive kind of cultural and religious change that's unprecedented. And I'm like, well, the increase of the population up to 25% Muslim is a significantly smaller change in the religious makeup of this country than the secularization of this country that we've seen over the last half a century, right? And that's not even saying that the Muslims that would come here would stay Muslim, right? So the people who grew up in Muslim households would stay Muslim. We've seen the secularization of the education system replicate itself as well in children, regardless of their background. So there are loads of assumptions here that don't make sense, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I also know that it's really taboo to say this, but I'm just like, I don't understand like what the kind of inherent, he says that the problem here is that this is going to cause cultural change, it's going to undermine the social contract. And I'm sorry, but cultural change is part of life. It's part of society. I mean, there was a time when this land was Catholic, and it's not anymore. There was a time when, homosexuality was criminalized in this country. It's not anymore. There was a time when women couldn't go out to work, and that's not the case anymore. Like, cultural change is kind of an inevitable fact of society. And when we talk about the social contract, again, this idea that the presence of non-white people is the thing that's tearing up the social contract, rather than the decimation of any kind of third space or public space, the decimation of housing, all of these material things that are destroying the social contract, the rampant individualism, the hyper individualism ushered in by Margaret Thatcher, and that continues to rip through our society, where people are encouraged to not think of themselves as a part of society, but to think of themselves as individuals who compete against one another for resources, and where it's considered to be a positive trait that you're willing to tread on others to get to where you need to be. The way that, like, to me, that is a cultural change that has ripped apart the social contract. That has caused immense amounts of loneliness and immense problems in this country. But that there's a much more explicit connection between the rampant rise of hyper-individualism and the decline of the social contract than merely the presence of Black and brown people in this country. And it also goes without saying that when you look at these models, a big reason why the white British population will be in decline, if we are to consider that will come true, is because of the rise of people with mixed heritage, which is going to include people who are maybe white, who have children with people who aren't white. So once you've closed the borders and hopefully not deported every single person who's darker than a paper bag out of the country, what's next is anti-miscegenation laws. because that's how you really make sure that the mixed population doesn't rise. Because if you're mixed, you're not white, you're something else. But maybe we haven't got to the point yet where mixed people are just as scary as brown people.
And that's the thing, that you hear the phrase so often from people who will say, well, I don't recognize the country anymore. I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure when you were young, when these older people were younger who talk about not kind of recognizing the country anymore, I'm pretty sure the people who were your age back then didn't recognize the country pre-war. And likewise, the generation before them didn't recognize the country. These changes always happen. And the idea that we are being fed by people like Matt Good and people like Rupert Lowe, that ethnic demographic change is the one kind of change that is bad, because they talk about precious few other changes as being uniquely negative in the same way. I wonder what could possibly be the motivation for having that specific focus. I couldn't possibly comment. But again, it's this idea that we should live in a time capsule of 40 years ago and pander to the politics of nostalgia over what we should be looking forward and what we should be creating in this country. By all means, people should talk about how we create a social contract, how we create a cohesive society, how we create kind of a culture where we are accepting, but we can also bring people together rather than divide each other, right? I'm all down for all of those things. Happy to be able to have some kind of view of what the society will look like and be able to engineer that somehow rather than just letting the chips fall where they may. Totally down for that, not a problem. But the idea that somehow there's this unique problem of demographic change on the basis of ethnicity or on the basis of religion, and specifically here, it's Islam that's the problem, again, rather than what I pointed out earlier, secularism. Again, to me, it seems like there's only one possible ideological reasoning for getting to this point. Thank you very much, Dalia, for joining me tonight. Absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having me, Helena.
As always look forward to Ladies' Night every week. And thanks everyone at home for tuning in as well. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.